I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on Gadigal land. I've spent most of my life gratefully on Ngunnawal Ngambri land, and I'm about to relocate myself to the Yuin Nation, and I pay deep respects to all the elders on those lands. I was signed up as the Wayzgoose Press executor about 10 years ago. Being a fellow letterpress printer, being younger, and being, in their opinion, reasonably sensible yet fun, these were the criteria they were looking for. It was a simple will. The State Library of Victoria had purchased half of their archives years before and would inherit the rest, including their production files, upon their deaths. A small number of people got cash bequests, including their production file, got cash bequests. The letterpress equipment went to me, exactly doubling my existing studio equipment. The proceeds of the sale of their Katoomba property would also go to the SLV, and that too had a simple brief. The money was to be spent on book arts, and my job was to make sure it wasn't spent, and I quote, on fucking computers. And in the first quarter of last year, my role was made official upon their respective deaths. I've spent most of the last 2 years dealing with the estate, and the property sold last Saturday for $1.21 million. I'm presenting this paper because another directive from them was to give up teaching and all that stupid marketing and just get on with printing. So as executor, I will always be involved with the estate during my lifetime, but I don't want it to eat up time for my own personal practice. So here I am, essentially speed dating, to start the process of tempting others into exploring the delectable, complicated archives left by these two talented, warm yet prickly, highly opinionated humans, especially now that they are no longer on this earth to argue back. It's early days. The State Library of Victoria is only now starting to process their largesse, and what I share today is just a teaser. So do I press this? The green arrow. Woo. The Wayzgoose Press was the love child of Michael Hudson and Jadwiga Jarvis, or as I call them, the Wayzgeese. They were 8 years apart in age and had vastly different upbringings. Mike was a young child in wartime London with many sisters, and his family had lived in the same London area for generations. He was fully immersed in the swinging 60s and the discontent of the 70s, attending art school, managing Ronnie Scott's jazz club when Jimi Hendrix and Rolling Stones were playing there, teaching photography at Hornsey College, and building up a successful practice in photography and graphic arts, including doing calligraphy for the advertising industry. Jadwiga grew up in post-war Poland, then Israel. Her parents were Schindler Jews and were part of Spielberg's research for Schindler's List. She comes from a highly creative family. Her uncles were Joe Gross, a successful London-based photographer, and Yoram Gross, who moved to Australia and is best known here for his animation Dot and the Kangaroo. Jadwiga went to Hornsey College for a while and later worked as a professional animator, first for Yoram on Dot, where she pioneered a number of animation techniques, and then for other businesses through the early 80s, working on special effects for things like an animated ABC logo and other more commercial businesses. She spent a number of years traveling the world representing Australian animation industries. Hot fact, Mike was her Uncle Joe's best friend. She had a thing for him as a 16-year-old, then her family moved from Israel to Australia after she married a friend to avoid national service. When she got divorced in the early 1980s, she returned to the UK, seduced Mike, and within 2 months, they'd shacked up together in Sydney, happily in Mike's case, to escape Thatcher. They believed in themselves as a couple. They John and Yoko'd, eventually cutting ties with their extended families and put all their energy into the potential of their life together. They rarely spent time away from each other, and eventually they refused to even travel apart from day trips to Sydney. Mike's early years in Sydney were spent trying to involve himself in the Australian arts and crafts scene. He got involved with the Crafts Council, the Sydney Bookbinders and Calligraphy Guilds, and in particular two short-lived entities, the Calligraphy and Book Art Studio, or CABAS, founded by Margot Snape, and the Australian Printing Historical Society, founded by James Taylor. Mike's design, writing, calligraphy and wood engraving skills were in high demand, and he embarked on a number of projects for better or worse. One of these was the establishment of the Wayzgoose Journal together with James Taylor. Sorry, I forgot to put the slide in, so I'm holding it up. And those who are watching online, you can just Google Wayzgoose 1 and you'll at the Australian Journal of Book Arts, and you'll be able to see the cover. Conceived to be a series, the production of this one-off journal was an adventure that had a seminal influence on the reclusive and independent nature of the Wayzgoose Press, and again is a whole research project in itself. Suffice to say that this project is where they lost any lingering capacity to work nicely with others, and it drove them to retreat from the city to find their own corner of the world in which to produce what the hell they liked, when they liked, as they liked. They bought a 15-acre hillside block in the unfashionable semi-rural side of Katoomba in the Blue Mountains purely because of its large shed. Once they had the house and immediate grounds sufficiently tamed and sculpted, they ignored the rest of the block, allowing it to regenerate, dry out, burn, flood, whatever the weather threw at it. Their lives revolved around the studio and their small cosy house full of books and collected print ephemera. They were complete beginners to letterpress when they worked on the Wayzgoose Journal. They had many skills, including printmaking, but no experience of letterpress. Their early attempts to obtain equipment happened because said equipment was being decommissioned from various Sydney sites, but what they got was problematic: unloved presses, damaged, patchy typefaces. It took a few years of buying, selling, trading, and chucking for their studio to become fully workable, but they did their best with what they had, and their best was streets ahead of anything I've ever seen by unskilled practitioners. Their very early work, which is not these images, is clunky, but not in ways that a general viewer would recognise. As skilled creative professionals, they learned fast from books, examples, and improvisation. This time-consuming progression towards the standard they want to achieve gave them a perpetually didactic attitude. They saw the Australian scene, and quite rightly, as a backwater, and wanted to A, help lift the standard without actually teaching or mentoring anyone else in any practical capacity, and B, constantly letting everyone know how hard this craft was to master. So as I'll show through the following slides, they did their best to be a classic private press, but they also approached their output in a very individual way. Their strong graphic skills flavour everything, and their defining characteristic is something I discussed in my own doctorate: material poetics, a sighting of meaning within materiality and the particular openings that materials can offer. You can see an excellent example of this in these two broadsides, the first of which was printed as a regular broadside in an edition of about 20 copies, and the second produced a couple of years later as a tip-in for the UK fine press journal Matrix in an edition of 850 copies. With any other press, the irregular print quality of the worn wood type would be considered desirable, and the contemporary technical term for that is colour. For the Wayzgoose, it was a very deliberately constructed fade, and they spent more time making the top half of the text print perfectly as a metaphor for the difficulties they were up against. Now, there are very few letterpress printers these days who care about such competence. Most either print with plastic plates that give perfect impression, or, like myself, value the irregularities of letterpress in the face of relentless digital perfection. I chose this image to introduce their practice of making multiple versions of the one idea, sometimes as a one-off like this Matrix opportunity, where they simplified the woodblock and swapped out the very worn wood type for a face that was more controllable during such a big edition. Sometimes they even recycled the same title. Globalization was used for 3 broadsides, which can be quite confusing. Also, as you can see, they like to insert themselves into their work. So this was their happy place, the studio in its heyday. To avoid interruptions, they eventually adopted a nocturnal lifestyle, sleeping through the day, doing a bit of shopping or gardening for a couple of sunshine hours, and then working all through the night with the wood stove fired up. It helped that this routine also kept them in sync with their European friends, especially when they had email technology. Even when they stopped full-time print production, they kept to their nocturnal habits. So a boozy dinner party for us was actually a boozy lunch for them. Despite grumbling about the time and effort it took to produce their work, they were fiercely proud of it, fully cognizant of their abilities and the quality of their output. Every work was discussed, designed, and produced together, with each contributing their particular skills, and every work was informed by some broader aspect of book culture, whether historical, etymological, or contemporary. Writing about the labour of private press work in the face of encroaching computer technology, Jadwiga, who was the chief correspondent, said, "Rather than be dissuaded from the whole idea, it has only served to upgrade our resolve to full-scale sheer bloody-mindedness. If we didn't care much for the 20th century before, we now positively loathe it. Stopping the world and getting off has never had a higher priority." But what to print? When they started, Australia was ramping up to celebrate the bicentennial of white settlement. People were appreciating Australian history, and it was suddenly cool to find out that you had a convict ancestor, or that your family was part of the gold rush, or a migrant. Australian literature was being taught in all the universities, unlike today when you'd be hard-pressed to find any course at all dedicated to it. As foreigners, they became very interested in Australian history and thought it would be a good idea to focus on Australian content in terms of private press output. They did a number of prints and books using historical texts. The Van Diemen's Land Warriors, originally printed and published in 1827 by Tasmania's first printer, Andrew Bent, Bound for the Goldfields by Charles Dickens, The Isle of Pines by Henry Neville, and Henry Lawson's The Old Shop and the New. Mike also had a stab at exploring Indigenous designs, which is a bit uncool these days. While this Australiana sold, it wasn't flying off the shelves, and I don't think it really appealed to an international market. Their first real taste of trying something completely original happened when a writer friend sent Jadwiga a fun piece to read for her amusement. The Cure by Jyoti Branson was a tale of cancer and madness. Mike wrote a piece for Matrix 14 about his creative response to the manuscript, and it speaks of a revelatory, I can never say that word, moment when he realised he was having trouble developing an illustrative response because the writing was tonal rather than conventionally visual. As you can see in the image, instead of their usual text-image combination, they used only text, but orchestrated like a music score, working with fonts, scale and colour to animate the reading. The cover design on the left there was innovative, using fine lead rules, printed and overprinted, arranged to create the negative shape of the word cure in the book cloth. Again, when they developed an interesting technique, they would reuse it. This particular technique was a particularly labour-intensive process, and you can see how they pushed it to create a Moira effect. They only used it 3 times, for the cure, for this odd playful print on the left, and as the guest artist for this 1994 issue of Bookways Journal. And I've never seen it used by any other printers. Their didactic urge manifested a series of monographs on printing, printmaking and private presses, and this, I think, is their main legacy, and the series, I think, should be reproduced as a mainstream publication. For some reason, there was a set of these in the main stacks of the Canberra School of Art Library, and so these were my first encounter with the press. Each volume has a theme. The first, a pressing argument, considers the differences, technical and philosophical, between letterpress and more modern methods of text reproduction. The second, it goes against the grain, explore the difference between wood engraving and woodcut techniques. Number 3 was, broadly speaking, an overview of the history of broadside printing. And number 4, printers and politics, covered the nature of politically motivated printers, presses and publishers. This series has great examples of the thoughtful embellishments that are present in everything they did, like the numbers on the cover, which are lino cut printed so as to move progressively across the collected covers. Another unifying element is the initial 2-colour dropped caps that, as you can see, spelled type across the 4 volumes, necessitating some careful writing of the lead sentences. This is a spread from volume 2 showing the same image rendered in wood engraving on the left and woodcut on the right, including the tools it takes to print them, to carve them. The original image was produced for Alec Bolton's 1992 Brindabella Press edition of Untold Lives. Mike produced images for 3 Brindabella volumes, and this is a little spruik, as you can see, for Michael Richards' recent National Library release of a bibliobiography of the Brindabella Press, in which Mike's prints feature prominently. Not all of their plans for books came to fruition. They thought about doing Alice in Wonderland, and I'm glad they didn't because it's become a bit of a cliche to do that in the private press world. After producing The Cure, they were inspired to give James Joyce a similar textual tonal treatment, but like so many before and after them, they were rejected by the Joyce estate. This was probably a good thing because they were juiced up for something wild and experimental, and when rejected, looked for something similar to play with, a decision that transformed their book printing. And here's where I start speeding a little bit more, because if I covered everything properly, we'd be here for hours. But this is the big turning point, away from classical private press work and closer to something akin to limited edition artist books. The origin story is Mike and Jadwiga were mad about jazz, which is why they connected so strongly with Des Cowley of the SLV. They'd heard an ABC broadcast of the performance poetry of the recently late jazz duke, and to quote them, had been struck by the thunderbolt, feeling the kinship of performed poetry to jazz. Duke's manuscripts were in the care of fellow performance poet Pio, who was enthusiastic about the Wayzgoose having a crack at Dardakampfen Leben und Tod, or Darda's life and death struggle, and he provided an introductory text. The book demanded to be large scale, and they hit upon a technique of printing 2 up on a full sheet of paper using the entire width of the press, printing and overprinting as many times as deemed necessary. The total printing tally was 2,000 to make an edition of 35, which became 34 after one botched page because they were complete perfectionists. They then assembled the sheets into a concertina format using a folded tab on each page and a glue stick. This process worked so well that it was repeated for each of the following books. Terrific Days of Summer. Ken Bolton they found him in the pages of Heat Journal, was the next major book project. Again, it meandered through a long concertina format embellished by hand-coloured blocks, wave-bent rules and travelling text lines. The hot, steamy summer effects were Jadwiga's innovation, probably a throwback to her animation days, created by printing directly from clumps of cling wrap. They then turned back to the ferocious energy of Pio. It was here that they had the chance of a poet actually wanting to interact with their production process, which they firmly rejected. This book by itself, combined with its tense backstory, would make an excellent research project. My doctorate interrogated collaborative processes between printers, poets and artists, and I used the Wayzgoose as an example of printers who absolutely refused to collaborate with their authors. But in fact, they were a fantastic collaboration in their own right with each other. Pio's Ockers was the perfect critique of the worst of Australian culture, and you can see the fun that Mike had with his liner cuts on every page. Orpheus Through the Rear Vision Window is the only book in this series of experimental large format books with the text explicitly written for the press. George Alexander had provided the introduction to the Ken Bolton book, and they approached him to write something original for them. Jadwiga wrote that he submitted to our request happily like a goose to orange sauce. Again, this didn't mean that he had any say in the production design. They were firmly a two-person team. You can see that they retained the concertina format and that Jadwiga returned to her cling wrap idea, but this time using big plastic bags. The white comma, double comma shapes are actually holes cut through the pages. This, the last printed book of the press, was an original unpublished text, but not written specifically for them. Their large concertina book structure was tweaked to allow gatefolds, which made the material pages echo the walls of the printed rooms. After making this intricate production, they drew a line, ceasing book production. Their statement on this: for 20 years, we have adhered to our resolve never to repeat ourselves. With that in mind, we have exploited, expanded, changed, pushed, stretched, and invented the ways in which letterpress technology can be used to creative ends. And by doing so, we have ventured into a bookish outer space where not many collection managers can follow. You can see Jadwiga lying on the studio floor next to a section of the open book. It's not even the full book. That is the scale of all the books you've seen from Dada to Dorothy. From 1985 to 2007, they were incredibly active as a full-time private press. There was always a book project in production, always a broadside or 2 or 4, depending on their energy. In 1989, they were visited by German artist Werner Enck, who invited them to participate in an annual weekend printers event that he and his friend Telsa had put together called Typomania. Their first effort was in 1992, the image here on the left. They never travelled to Germany in the 27 years that they participated. They were sent the paper every year and took a lot longer to print their contribution than the other printers did, but they always made sure that their package arrived by the Typomania weekend. While they stopped making books in 2007, as a kind of retirement, they kept making one broadside a year, 2 versions of the one design, one for their collectors and one for the Typomania edition. Over their printing life, they produced 19 publications and 45 broadsides. The Typomania project set a theme every year, usually political, and this encouraged them to really lash out at the world. Only one of their broadsides is truly ageless in a Dorian Gray sort of way. This was printed in 1997, and maybe we should all ritually burn all the copies, and that might end it. Oop. True to a conventional private press, they made ex libris book plates, keepsakes for their visitors, and collectible prospecti. Jadwiga was a cutting reviewer, keen article author, and hardcore letter writer. So there's a large archive of correspondence with collectors, institutions, which are mostly arguments about prices and legal deposit, other printers and friends. The letter on the right was from Pio regarding who might write the introduction to Ockers, and he decided it was not going to be Graham Blundell. While Jadwiga was writing, making furniture or pottery, Mike was making designer bindings for their own publications, as well as practicing on commercial volumes. The wooden object on the right is a bookcase made by Jadwiga for Mike's sculpted leather binding of Beowulf. Every single one of their publications had a unique or limited edition of designer bindings. I'm scooting through now. As I mentioned earlier, Mike had professional calligraphy skills and liked to wield them for his own pleasure in later years. His lettering for the Homer quote on the left was used as inspiration for his bespoke headstone, which I'll show you soon. The cabinet shown here holding his tools was built by Jadwiga, who built most of their furniture. In 2007, to draw a line in the sand in their retirement, they, or rather Jadwiga, produced the Wayzgoose Affair. There's a copy here. Ostensibly a catalogue of their work, it's a rich, complex, idiosyncratic journey through their history and bibliography. Whenever I asked some questions about their works or events, I would invariably be told, it's in the book, but more often than not, it wasn't. For one thing, they produced broadsides for another 12 years after publishing it. But mainly it was because the Wayzgoose Affair is an inconsistent record. For people who are so concerned with the world of books and who are such avid, erudite readers, their own book is meandering, hard to follow, and not proofed thoroughly. There is no index, there's vague dates, there's no edition numbers for works, and no clear production details. And it's awkwardly big and really heavy. So hopefully the State Library of Victoria will put together a clear and accurate bibliography of their entire oeuvre. So for the next 12 years, they produced magnificent broadsides, one a year in 2 editions. Their printing skills continued to develop, and their ability to achieve visual effects by manipulating the type height via subtle packing was superb. The image on the right used laser cut acrylic lettering bumped up to type high. And I've tried doing this. The acrylic is really slippery. How they manage such controlled visual effects is a secret they take to their grave. These were the last 2 completed posters. The one on the left is one of my favourites because it uses a stream of Donald Trump drivel. The one on the right quotes Dylan Thomas. Do not go quietly into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage at the dying of the light. The type was still set on the galley when I packed up the studio, and it was very sorrowful to break it up and return the letters to the typecase. This was their unfinished business. The blocks were sitting on the studio workbench, and it would have been magnificent. When I was there organising Mike's funeral, Jadwiga told me that the blocks were going to the SLV, but no one should ever be allowed to print them. Note that. And this is Mike's unfinished business finished. Back in his early Sydney days, he was commissioned to produce wood engravings towards a book about the French Battle of Poitiers, hope I'm saying that right, in 1356 during the 100 Years' War. The book plans fell through, but the project haunted Mike for decades. He would engrave blocks and at one point started a poster series, but finally, after a spate of health problems, he decided to create a folio of 7 prints with a letterpress commentary in an edition of 10 copies, and he finished this in 2018. The final project left to me to complete was the fulfilment of Mike's desire to have a headstone made in the style of stonecutter David Kindersley, who was dead by that point, but he had an apprentice who was now in her 70s, 80s, and it's now called the Cardoza Kindersley Workshop in Cambridge, UK. Jadwiga and I designed the stone using Mike's own calligraphy, and by the time they actually started cutting, she had died too. It was my lockdown project. It's hand-carved in blue-black Welsh slate, white painted with gold embellishments. It cost to make and send over about $35,000 and stands proudly in the Katoomba cemetery. And I guarantee you it's a lovely day trip if you live in Sydney. So, come on. How do I go back? Probably can't. That was, it's at the red button. This is the SLV team in June this year, finally out of lockdown and having packed a wall of boxes. It was, I think, the last major project of Des Cowley's career. And yes, he did inherit some of the jazz records. And I want to thank the team for their hard work and support. So have I tempted anyone? I really hope so. Thanks for listening.